We've been having Sabbath lunch with Jesus in Luke chapter 14. Let's begin there again. It happened as Jesus went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath that they watched him closely. Remember the story. A Pharisee, a ruler of the Pharisees, a top dog Pharisee, invites Jesus over for lunch. Now, the Pharisees were his avowed enemies. When your enemy invites you for lunch, you may be concerned that you're going to be the one that's for lunch, right? It's usually not because they want to spend time in kind conversation. But Jesus accepts the invitation to the enemy's house, as it were, for lunch. And they, turns out to be more than just a ruler of the Pharisees, are watching him closely. So he realizes when he walks in the room, he is on slippery ground. He is being scrutinized. And there was a man there, a certain man before him, who had dropsy. So one of the people who's been invited is bloated, retaining water severely, obviously ill. And Jesus answering spoke to the lawyers and the Pharisees. Now that tells me that the ruler of the Pharisees invited over all of his fellow Pharisees and their cohorts in the religious legal field, because you see, if you're a legalist, you need a lawyer. And so the legalists had lawyers, and this was all part of the cadre that wanted Jesus gone, because his message of grace and the love of God was death to their whole system, and they knew it. So by reading down there into verse 3, we can see that a ruler of the Pharisees invited a whole bunch of other Pharisees and lawyers, and when Jesus walks in, he doesn't just walk into a house with a lion in it, it's a whole den of lions. And there's this one sick dude there. Jesus reads the crowd. He knows immediately what's going on. They've set him up. He likes to heal people. And they're going to see what he does with this one sick guy. They probably wouldn't have invited the sick guy except for the fact they needed, the stooge. They needed the setup. So this poor guy who's ill, in pain, unhealthy, is also in a very awkward position. And the elephant in the room, as they're all watching him closely, is what will Jesus do? It's the Sabbath. And Jesus knows the rules. So I like the way Jesus handles it. Have you noticed that Jesus is not always gentle, Jesus meek and mild? Sometimes he walks into a room and picks a fight. It's always a good fight. It's never a fight dealing with his own insecurities or issues or need to control. Usually when we pick a fight, we got a few ponies in the race, right? Where it's something about us. But when Jesus picks a fight, it's always about others and about God. So Jesus just hits it head on. Okay, guys, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? He knows that's what they're trying to catch him at. And he simply exposes, I know this is a setup. So, is it lawful for me? Is it allowable? The word law in the Greek is not in the word lawful there, the word behind lawful. It's more a word, is it allowed? Is it permissible? Is it okay to heal on the Sabbath? Now, as we know, they had a rule that said if you were a caregiver, you could make sure the person you were caring for didn't get any worse. But if you helped them get better, you were working on the Sabbath. You should wait till after Sabbath to help them get better. Now, that's not a Bible law. You're all clear on that, right? That was a Pharisee law. And when Jesus asked the question, it says they were silent. They did not have an answer. They didn't want to answer. They knew either way they answered, they'd be in trouble. And they just wanted to get him in trouble, so they were just silent. It's the word there beside silent doesn't have to do with noise. It has to do with stillness. They didn't move a muscle. So, they didn't seem to protest. So it says Jesus took him. It literally means he took a hold of the man and healed him. You know, like the Pillsbury Doughboy all of a sudden is slender. The guy's all bloated from dropsy, and wonder what that looked like. And let him go. The word means to say he sent him away. He dismissed the guy from the awkward situation. He healed him and sent him home. I don't even know if the guy got lunch. But Jesus released the man from the difficult situation, but he released him whole and healed. I don't think the man went away feeling dissed at all. He was probably glad to be out of there and amazed to be well. Then Jesus answered them, saying, which of you, having a donkey or an ox that has fallen into a pit, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? And they could not answer him regarding these things. You treat people worse than animals. You'll help a suffering animal on the Sabbath, but you won't help a suffering person. What's wrong with you guys? And they were speechless. They didn't have a thing to say. Now, we spent a little time the last couple of Sabbaths that I was here talking about what's lawful to do on the Sabbath. And we've noticed the Bible doesn't have a lot of rules. The Pharisees made up about 600 extra rules. The Bible has a half a dozen. Fourth commandment, don't work. And your family, your servants, your animals, everybody gets a day off. Right? And we picked out two different verses. One where it says, don't light a fire on the Sabbath. And another one that says, don't pick up sticks, don't gather sticks on the Sabbath. And we talked about what's the spirit behind that, how would that apply today? You'll have to go back and listen. I'm not going to re-preach those sermons. The last time we were together, I pointed out that two other places in the New Testament, Jesus uses this same approach. The question is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Jesus gives the animal illustration, uses three different versions of it, but you'll lead your donkey or your ox or your sheep or whatever out to water, or you'll get them out of the ditch. You'll take care of your animals on the Sabbath. And the one that we looked at in particular, joining the story in both Matthew and Mark, Jesus went into the synagogue. There was a man there who had a withered hand. And they asked him, saying, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Here they asked him. You know, in our story in Luke 14, he asked them. Here they ask him, that they might accuse him. They were hoping he'd say yes, and then they say, see, you're a Sabbath breaker. Now, Mark, I put there in yellow, adds these words. Then Jesus said to them, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? Now, it's interesting. They say, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? And Jesus says, well, you tell me, is it lawful to do good or bad on the Sabbath? Which is lawful? He takes their question and he shifts it just a little bit and he makes it ridiculously obvious. Because leaving someone in pain would be doing evil by not doing anything. Helping them would certainly be doing good. And the way Luke puts it, to save life or to destroy is the word that Luke uses. To save life or to kill, to save life or to destroy. So Jesus, they ask the question, and Jesus just rephrases it, throws it back at them in a way that they don't dare answer because they're going to look like inconsistent fools either way. So they kept silent. Then it says Jesus said to them, okay, so what man among you has one sheep, and if it falls in the pit on the Sabbath, will not lay hold of it and lift it out? There's his animal illustration. It's a little parable. Of how much more value then is a man than a sheep? That's a pretty good question, isn't it? They seem to care more for their sheep than for hurting people. And then Jesus simply declares, therefore it is lawful, it is allowable to do good on the Sabbath. Now, I opened a can of worms 3 weeks ago, on this. And I want to open that can just a little bit again today. It's an interesting question to ask, what is lawful to do on the Sabbath? Because just asking the question that way frames the whole discussion. What is lawful for me to do in my marriage? Now, by asking it that way, first of all, I'm being a guy. That's the kind of question a guy would ask, right? What can I get away with and not lose you? Is that even the right way to frame the discussion? Relationships don't work on that kind of language. What's lawful for me to do if I'm your friend? You know, what words can I not say to you if I'm your friend? What words can I not use if I'm your spouse? What things do I need to be careful that I don't do so I don't offend you? That's not relational. That's not friendly. That's not warm and fuzzies. That's get her done, get it right, don't mess up. And marriages don't work that way. Anybody discover that? Guys, any of you discover that? Women don't work that way? So in a way, the question is slanted right from the top. It's really the wrong question. Because the Sabbath isn't about getting it right, it's about getting together. And that's a huge difference. You know, I was giving some Bible studies to a couple probably 20 years ago now. And I came in one week to do our Bible study, and they said, we don't need Bible studies anymore. We talked to a different pastor, and he said, we don't need to worry about the Sabbath. So we've joined another church. Okay. You know, it's a free country. But evidently they had the Sabbath framed to them as duty and obligation and rules, and we're free from that. We're free from all that stuff called Sabbath. Let me tell you something. If that's how you're keeping the Sabbath, you're not keeping the Sabbath even if you're keeping the Sabbath. If it's duty and obligation, you're not experiencing Sabbath at all. I just want to go to one verse today and kind of ask the question, what was the original purpose of Sabbath? And one of the cool things about Sabbath is we can take it back to before sin. Because if you think about that, is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath? What kind of good comes to mind? As I thought about it, about everything I could think of in the doing good on the Sabbath would be doing something to undo the problems of sin. You know, if I help somebody who's hurting, well, they're hurting because of sin. There wouldn't have been a hurting person before sin. So there wouldn't need to be any of that kind of help on the Sabbath before sin because nobody needed it. There wouldn't have been any emergencies. There wouldn't have been any oxes in the ditch. It was a perfect world. What are you going to do on Sabbath in a perfect world? You don't need to go witnessing. There's nobody to witness to. They're all in. You don't need to fix anything. You don't need to help any hurting people. You don't need to this. You don't need to that. Nobody's hungry. Nobody needs to be fed. Nobody's naked and needs to be clothed. Nobody's down and out and needs to be encouraged. So what in the world would we do on Sabbath if there wasn't any good to be done? Because I've discovered often we fill up our Sabbath with doing good things. All of which wouldn't even be available to be done in a perfect world. And all of a sudden, if we take the Sabbath back to before creation, this question of what's lawful is ridiculous. So what would we do on the Sabbath in a perfect world? Unfortunately, Adam and Eve, crashed the plane before we really had much history to figure that out. But the one verse, very first verse on the Sabbath, thus the heavens and the earth and all the host of them were finished. This is after the sixth day of creation, when God declared it very good. Notice at the end of 6 days, the heavens, the earth, and the host were finished. That would be whatever's up there, whatever's down here, and all the inhabitants, fish, birds, animals, people, bugs, everything. Okay? The ecosystem is functioning fully, from the macro to the micro level. You know, from the amoebas and the I had a word, it just left me, the tiny stuff down there, microbes, there we go, to the, you know, the dinosaurs and the elephants. It's all done and functioning, and it's good. And on the seventh day, God ended his work which he had done. Now, one of the things that bugs me about Bible translation is when I see the same original word, just a few words apart from each other, but they translate it differently. I want to see the parallels. The word ended in verse 2 and the word finished in verse 1 are the same identical Hebrew word. So in 6 days, the ecosystem was finished, but God wasn't finished because God finished his work on the seventh day. So creation continued on the seventh day, even though the entire physical ecosystem was finished. So evidently our world is more than just a physical system, as science would want you to think. There must be some other dimension because God finished his work on the seventh day. And what did he do? He rested. Now the word for rest is the word Shabbat, from which we get the word Shabbath, which becomes Sabbath to us. And it means to cease. It doesn't mean to take a nap. It doesn't mean to do nothing. It means to cease doing something, and that opens things up for doing something else. Does that make sense? So God stopped doing something on the seventh day, but he wasn't doing nothing because he finished the overall work on the seventh day, even though he was finished with the physical ecosystem part of it. And he ceased from that creation work on the seventh day, from all his work which he had done. He ceased from what he had already done. You know, after day 1, he kept on. After day 2, he kept on. After day 3, 4, 5, he kept on. After day 6, he stopped doing all that. He ceased on the seventh day from all the work that he had done, past tense. But he wasn't done yet because he finished on the seventh day. What did God do on the seventh day after he had ceased from the other work? Then God, what? Blessed. By the way, the Hebrew word there is barak. God blessed the seventh day, and he sanctified it. That's the word kodesh, for holy. He holified it. He sanctified it. Because that's what he did when he ceased from all the other work that he had been doing. So the finishing touch on creation was to bless and holy some time. Can you see blessed? Can you see holy? Not in this context. You know, if I had 2 chairs up here and I said, well, one is blessed and holy and the other one isn't, they'd look the same, right? You can't see blessed and holy. But is it real? If God blesses something, is that real? Is there something that's happened when God blesses something that we can't see but is as real as things we can see? And you're all just looking at me. When God holies something, is that real? Does that make it different, better? Yeah. You can't see it. And the way I like to put it is when God blesses and hallows something, that's not nothing. Awkward English. That's not nothing. And yet I know much of the world treats it as if it's nothing. I'd like to argue that blessed and holy is as real as rocks and trees. Even though I can't see it, it's as real as the physical creation, but is a spiritual dimension creation. And I need it as much as I need water and food, part of the physical creation. I need to experience the blessing and the holy. How do I do that? It's interesting, God doesn't introduce the Sabbath with a list of things we ought to do and not do. All he said is, I made the time blessed and holy. And then it's after sin. He says, now, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. I'd like to suggest you can't keep a day holy God didn't make holy, because you and I can't make anything holy. We can only holy something he's already holied. So now he says, way after sin, when the world's a mess, he says, remember that holy day that I made, and cease from your physical ecosystem survival, getting ahead, making more money, fixing all the things that break. Set that all aside. And your servants, and your animals. And everybody gets to cop out, drop out, and act like we're back in Eden. The Sabbath becomes a little piece of pre-sin plopped down in our sinful world once a week. Does that make sense? I get to spend a whole day where I don't have to worry about making a living. I don't have to worry about fixing things. I don't have to try to get caught up on this, that, and the other thing. I get to act like I'm already in heaven. There's not a care in the world. And go have a picnic with God. Hang out. Family, friends. You know, did you know, and I got yelled at 20 years ago, and I've said this in this very auditorium, the Bible never tells us to go to a building, sit in rows, and listen to a talking head on Sabbath. And I had a dear lady, long deceased now, she was sitting right over there and on the aisle. And she told me, I've been trying to get my grandson to come to church, and now you tell him he doesn't need to come to church. Why do we do church on Sabbath? I guess it's a way we try to hang out with God. You know, if you have the day off, it's the 4th of July, you have a barbecue and you invite friends over and you hang out together, right? It's kind of something we do on a holiday, a holy day. You do recognize that's where we get the word holiday, is holy day. That's where the word comes from. The 4th of July is a holy day because we've set it aside, we've sanctified it to honor the founding of our country. It's not holy in a religious sense, but it is set apart, sanctified for a special purpose. And it's not just hot dogs and root beer and potato salad. It's actually remembering what built this great country that we have. So you think about a holiday. Sabbath is a weekly holiday. And what do we do on holidays? We usually get together with friends. And so in a way, Sabbath is to get together with God and others where we share this spiritual heritage and we enjoy fellowship and time together. We're free from all other cares. And we get to hang out. So church is a custom. And I think it's mostly a good one. Except sometimes it's an awful lot of work for some of us on Sabbath. But notice the original Sabbath thing was God was done with the ecosystem, but he blessed and holied a day. And then he invites us to enter into that blessed, holy time, which I think connects us directly with him. So doing good is not something we're supposed to do on the Sabbath, because there really wasn't any good to be done when the Sabbath began. Everything was good. Which brings me to why I kind of suggested the last time we were together, don't fill your Sabbath with so many good things that you don't have time to hang out with Jesus. We need to kick back and sit down and hang out with Jesus. And sometimes we can be so busy fixing the problems of the world, which it is lawful to do on the Sabbath, that we don't have any time to rejuvenate ourselves. You could really say that the Sabbath is about self-care. And I don't mean psychologically as much as I mean we need downtime, and we need downtime with God. And so he gives us a whole day. And he says, just don't work on that day. Well, what if my boss wants me to work? Well, tell him you're not available. Well, what if he fires me? Trust me, God says. I'll take care of you. And I've never seen anyone lose their job over the Sabbath that God has not done something even better in their lives. Oh, but it's risky business. It's kind of like paying tithe. God says, give me 10%. He doesn't say, I'll give you $1 million a year salary if you'll give me 100,000 back. He says, give me 10% of whatever you have, even though you don't think you have enough. And I'll take care of you from there. He doesn't buy us off like Satan accused God of buying Job off. He challenges us to risk. And the Sabbath is very much the same way. Because the world doesn't understand the Sabbath. So for us to take the seventh day and set it aside to hang out with God is to be out of sync with the rest of the world. And I've seen people lose their jobs because they say, nope, I'm not available on the Sabbath, sorry. And the boss says, I don't need you anymore. And you have to say, okay, Lord, what's next? And trust that God will take care of you. I've heard lots of stories. The guy that owned a donut shop in Columbia, South Carolina 40 years ago, it's an old story, but I knew the guy, the pastor that baptized him, and, the biggest donut day was Sabbath, and he decided to close his donut shop, and everybody said, you're nuts, you'll be out of business in 2 months. And he now has the biggest, well, probably dead and gone by now, but he ended up having the biggest donut shop in town, and he was closed on the biggest donut day. God can do amazing things even if donuts aren't healthy. So when we look at this thing, if we're down into duty and obligation, what is it lawful? Let me meddle in one other area. Somebody asked me about this a couple weeks ago, so I'll meddle in it briefly. What about legitimate Sabbath work? What if you're in the healthcare industry? Sick people need to be cared for on Sabbath. Adventists own hundreds of hospitals, and believe it or not, they're open on Sabbath because people are still sick. And the doctor may need to have to do an emergency surgery that can't wait till after sunset. The baby is going to be born. You can't say, hold everything till sunset, then we'll deliver the baby. Now, I remember back in college, one acquaintance of mine said, I'm going to go into the medical profession because then it's okay for me to work on Sabbath. In other words, I can make more money, and it's okay to work on Sabbath if I'm in the medical profession. And I wanted to say, I think God is smarter than that. I knew another person in the medical profession there at an Adventist hospital. There were like 3 of them in a department, and one had to be on duty every Sabbath because it was necessary to operate the healthcare needs of the people. And so they were very careful to take their minimum rotation, not work any more Sabbaths than were necessary for the rotation. I mean, what do you do if all 3 in the rotation are Adventists, are Sabbath keepers? Then you're all going to be working every 3rd Sabbath. You know, one could say, I'll work every Sabbath and make more money. No, God's smarter than that. I knew one friend. They said they had decided that whatever money they made doing their Sabbath rotation, they would give away. Now, that's not required. God didn't say that. But they said, I want to make sure that I never go to work on Sabbath to make money. So I'm going to give that away. I'm giving that service. You know, the employer wouldn't be allowed to let you volunteer that day. The government won't allow it. So you get your... I'm not saying you have to do that. It was an interesting way for this person to check their covetousness, to check their own heart. What about policemen and firemen? If everybody was a Sabbath keeper, somebody'd still have to be a policeman or a fireman on the Sabbath, you know. We'll put the fire out after sunset, you know. We'll send the EMTs to the heart attack in 5 hours, you know, when Sabbath's over. That's not going to work. So there is legitimate things that have to be done on Sabbath for which they might be part of your employment. So you got to think about that. I don't think we ought to have a bunch of rules on that. I think you need to walk with Jesus. Ask him to deal with your heart. Make sure you're not doing it for the wrong reasons. Make sure you're not in it for yourself. And again, just a final point here on this part. I'm not sure there's much difference between working in a hospital on Sabbath, doing your rotation, or filling your Sabbath up with so much church work that by the end of the day, you haven't had any time to sit with Jesus and you're completely exhausted. Does that make sense? If somebody's hurting, help them on the Sabbath. Amen? If their roof is leaking and it's raining, help them on the Sabbath. If their roof is leaking and it's not raining, help them on Sunday. Does that make sense? I think we do what's necessary to help others in that time, what is timely expedient, but we need to be having time with God. So don't get so busy you miss Jesus on the Sabbath. All right? Just some thoughts. I will close with this verse. If you turn away your foot from the Sabbath, from doing your pleasure on my holy day, notice your pleasure. The Sabbath isn't a day where I get it off to do whatever I want to do. It's not about me. It's about you and him. It's about us. If I take a day off with my wife and she hates water and I always want to go swimming, we're not going to spend much time together. If we're going to have a day together for our relationship's sake, we need to do mutually enjoyable things together. So I don't think about, I'm taking Monday off, I can do whatever I want to. I'm taking Monday off. Marilyn, what would you like? What can we do together? What would we mutually enjoy? It's a together thing. Not doing your own pleasure, your pleasure on my holy day. Call the Sabbath a delight. May I suggest what you experience will have a lot to do with how you frame it in your mind. If you call the Sabbath duty, it's going to feel like duty. If you call the Sabbath obligation, it's going to feel like obligation. And by the way, it is a commandment. It's not an invitation, but that doesn't make it a duty or an obligation in that sense. It's a command to a blessing. It's a command to something holy. So start out by saying, you know, as a little kid, Sabbath was more about what I didn't do than what I could do. You know, Friday I had to shine my dad's shoes. I had to take the trash out to the burn barrel in the backyard when we used to be able to do that. And I had to pick up all the dog doo-doo in the backyard. That was Friday. I didn't like Friday. And then Sabbath meant I couldn't do this and I couldn't do that and I couldn't do something else. And sometimes it was downright boring. And I think as parents, one of the greatest challenges you have is how to make the Sabbath fun, interesting, and enjoyable for your kids with a God focus rather than a regular secular focus. But call it a delight. Start out by saying, Sabbath is coming. The way that the Hebrews, the Jews, counted the days of the week, they didn't have names for the days of the week. The word for week was the word Sabbath. And the first day was the first of the Sabbaton, the second of the Sabbaton. I'll meet you on the fourth of the Sabbaton. Every day of the week was looking forward to the Sabbath. It's those Romans that put the names on the days. Saturn and the moon and all their gods. Everything, it's supposed to be, wow, it's 7 days till the Sabbath. It's only 6 days, 5 days, 4 days, 3 days till the Sabbath. Oh, tomorrow's the Sabbath. Let's get ready because Sabbath is here. And instead of, oh boy, Sabbath is coming. Can't do anything for 24 hours. But Saturday night we can have fun. Once the sun goes down, we watch the sun go down. Yippee! Now call it a delight and start looking at how can we experience God in each other and worship and joy and rest and even service more fully. Call it a delight, the holy day of the Lord honorable. By calling it an obligation and a drudgery, you're not calling it honorable. Does that make sense? So start out positive. And shall honor him. There's the number one focus, hanging out with God. Not doing our own ways, not finding our own pleasure or speaking our own words. It doesn't mean if it's pleasurable you can't do it. It means it's not about what I want. It's about God and my family and my fellow believers, and what do we do together to experience this holy, blessed time. Then he says, you will delight yourself in the Lord. That sounds good, doesn't it? Delight yourself in the Lord? It sounds like Disneyland, you know? Happiness. Have you discovered that the only way to delight yourself in a relationship is to invest in the relationship? I'll cause you to ride on the high hills of the earth. If we put God first and honor that Sabbath time, he says you'll end up on top, not the bottom. You'll end up in the lead and not behind. It makes no sense that you will be better off in this sinful world if you only spend 6 days making money and developing your career and doing all that, while others are spending 7 days at it. Aren't you going to end up behind those that are spending 7 days when you're only spending 6? And God says, no, I'll see to it that you end up ahead. Ooh, I like that. I can get farther in 6 than they can get in 7, and I get a day off. and I'll feed you with the heritage of Jacob your father. You know, that's very Jewish, very Hebrew. But that has to do with all the promises to Abraham, all the promises to Isaac and Jacob, all the promises to Israel, which was sustenance, a land flowing with milk and honey. I'll take care of you. Peace, shalom, God watching our borders, taking care of us physically from harm. Your crop's not failing from an agrarian approach. He talks about that. I'll send the rain. You know, feeding you with the heritage of Jacob your father is not just food. It's the whole stuff of life, from peace and tranquility to healthy families to just laws to a just government to rain and the land. It's the whole enchilada of life. I'll feed you with that heritage. And then God says, it's out of my mouth. You can count on it. You can count on it. So I guess I had a lot more here. We're going to spend one more Sabbath, but we'll move on to the story next time. I think the question, what is it lawful to do on the Sabbath, is a lousy question. Because it frames the whole thing as legal obligation as opposed to intimate relationship. Now, Jesus is with a bunch of legalists. That's why they ask the question. He comes back. He has to deal with them where they are. But it's really not a good question. It won't work in your marriage. It won't work in your friendships. It probably won't even work on your job. Because you know the boss doesn't want you just pedantically doing the minimum necessary. If you want to thrive in your career, you go beyond. You're positive. You're not just, okay, what do I have to do so I don't lose my job? What's the minimum that I have to do so you don't fire me? That's not going to get you anywhere in your career. It won't get you anywhere in relationships. It won't get you anywhere with God. So it's really the wrong question. And Jesus tries to reframe it. Is it okay to do good or evil? To save life or to kill? You take care of your animal, would you take care of a person? But when we go back to the original framing, the Sabbath is about hanging out with God. Him giving us free time. Even in a sinful world, we don't have to worry about the sin problem. Help people that need help. Do what needs to be done in that way. But it's time for relationship and intimacy and rest and spiritual focus. It's holy time. If I put 7 glasses of water up here on a table, which one would quench your thirst? Any, right? Any glass of water will quench your thirst. But if I take the 7th glass and I squeeze some lemon and I put some sugar in it and I stir it up, now which glass will quench your thirst? Any of the 7. Which one tastes the best? One is blessed and hallowed, lemon and sugar. I believe there's something about the time of the Sabbath. When God said I made it blessed and holy, that means it's different, it's special, it's new and improved. It's a cut above. And if we enter into that, we'll have an experience we can't have any other day, any other way. Because when God blesses and hallows something, that's not nothing. That's something that we can experience if we enter into it. All right? He'll cause you to ride on the high places. He'll feed you with everything you need. God says, you hang with me, you abide with me. I'll take care of you. Let's pray. Jesus, forgive us for asking the wrong questions, for looking at Sabbath from duty and obligation rather than opportunity and blessing. Teach us how to look through glasses of delight when we look at the Sabbath. And think about honoring you Teach us how to enter into a little day, a little slice of eternity, before sin, after sin, that we can experience in the middle of a really broken world. But we can taste eternity. We can taste the lemonade of eternity a little bit on your holy day that's just not there the other days. You'll quench our thirst every day. But thank you for lemonade on the Sabbath. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.